Welcome to everybody. My name is Juliet Franklin. I'm a legal director in the employment department here at Acuity, and today we're going to be talking about the interesting and very topical issue of employment perks and benefits, and specifically focusing on the tax implications of them. It's probably trite to say that we live in a very different world to the one we knew 3 years ago, and the impact of the pandemic has led to a seismic change to the workplace. During the pandemic, we saw businesses adapt to unprecedented disruption and challenges. Businesses became leaner as they were forced to look inward and discover inefficiencies that could no longer be tolerated. Employees were generally grateful to remain employed and for the most part willing to cooperate with businesses for the survival of both parties. As we've emerged from the pandemic, the tables are very much turned. Businesses trying to get back to business as usual have found that they need to recruit to rebuild their workforce, either because they had reduced headcount during the pandemic or because staff have left the profession for one reason or another. The pandemic hit us all differently, and many have taken the opportunity to retrain, to take on passion projects, or to focus on other priorities such as home life. For one reason or another, most businesses are now in a position where recruitment and retention will be the key to success. The rise of remote working has meant more opportunities for employees to look outside of their geographical boundaries. Gone are the days where you need to be based in the same location as your employer is based. This has led to employees being tempted by the higher salaries offered in centres such as London, while still being able to work in their home location. The rise of remote working has made more recruitment opportunities possible as well. For roles that can be performed remotely, businesses can now look further afield for candidates, even abroad. With recruitment and retention at the forefront on many businesses' minds, we have seen a competitive, employee-friendly market. Many businesses have come to one very unimaginative solution: salary. Salaries across many professions are rising simply in an attempt to remain competitive, resulting in others doing the same. But this is not the only solution, and in fact not the best solution, especially as more and more businesses will be unable to justify or finance the salary raises. Instead, we should look at what modern employees want from their businesses: job satisfaction, work-life balance, flexibility, a sense of community, integration, purpose, and respect. These things cannot be built by simply increasing salary, and studies among millennials have shown that salary alone is becoming less important. So that's why we're here today, to discuss some of the more creative ways to support your recruitment and retention initiatives. There is a lot that we could get through, certainly more than this hour allows. What follows will be some high-level thoughts, of which there are no doubt many more. Hopefully, however, this session will prompt thought and discussion. I would like to introduce Paul Tucker, who's sat next to me. Paul is a senior employment taxes specialist at UNW. Paul has over 30 years experience and has expertise covering a wide range of employment tax issues, including HMRC inquiries and disclosures, benefits and expenses, employment status, and termination packages. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start. There is a chat function if there are specific points that people want to raise or questions that they want to ask about benefits they are thinking of implementing or offering. Please feel free to put these in the chat function and we will get to as many of these as possible. Okay, so turning to the first thing that we see more and more employers wanting to offer, and that relates to the growing importance of the need to tackle climate change. We're seeing many businesses now embracing the challenge of climate change, which they are finding that can then lead to gains in publicity, in trade, and in collaborations. We're also finding that an awful lot of employees are particularly interested and attracted to businesses which are embracing climate change and the needs to look after the environment in the future. As a result of this, we're seeing a growing interest in the offer of electric vehicles or EV schemes by way of salary sacrifice. Before I touch on some of the employment issues arising and policy issues arising out of this, Paul, do you want to tell us what is salary sacrifice and how does this work from the electric vehicle scheme perspective?
Okay, well, thank you for that, Julia. It's potentially a very big subject, and maybe the starting point is to talk about what HM Revenue and Customs ideas are around salary sacrifice. Now, historically, salary sacrifice has been used for many items. It originally kind of started as respect to childcare vouchers, maybe pension salary sacrifice. But then as time has progressed, more and more items have been provided by way of salary sacrifice. So much so that the revenue were rather concerned that it was being abused. So they introduced some new legislation in 2017 called the Optional Remuneration Arrangements, whereby they will now look very carefully at salary sacrifice and decide on whether the amount that's taxable should be the amount of the benefit or the amount that's been sacrificed. So this is particularly of interest where you're looking at salary sacrifice, let's say in relation to cars, where the actual amount of the benefit could be higher than employees originally anticipated. So the starting point, though, is to consider what are you sacrificing for? The revenue have some what they call favoured salary sacrifices, of which electric vehicles is one. So that's providing the vehicle does not exceed 75 grams of CO2, which of course an ultra low emission vehicle should fall below that. They won't be caught by these rules. So let me just take a step backwards. With electric vehicles, they should be eligible for the revenue favourable tax treatment. So as a result, if an employee sacrifices, let's say, £5,000 of pay and gets an electric vehicle, they may be taxed, let's say, for instance, on a very small percentage of the list price of that vehicle. So as a consequence, they're going to save a lot of tax, and of course, it's going to be environmentally friendly. So salary sacrifice is very good, but only for favoured benefits.
Thank you. And from the employment perspective, this is something that we're seeing, we've been asked to advise on more and more frequently. And I mean, I think the starting point is it's clearly from a selling your business perspective, it's a great benefit for as we discussed earlier, this is something that is very much attracting employees to want to work for environmentally sound, society aware businesses. And so we are seeing more of a move away from the normal car scheme or the car benefit scheme, and more employers who are looking to implement an electric vehicle scheme. I think the key to all of this always is to make sure that you have your policies in order and you have your policies in place. Nothing can underestimate the importance of making sure that the terms upon which the benefit is offered are clearly set out and are clearly available to all members of staff within the business. So, Paul, from the employer's perspective, is there a taxable benefit to the employer in offering the electric vehicle scheme in the same way as there is to the employee?
The cost to the employers for any benefit, your starting point is working out size of the taxable benefit. So if you've got a car with an electric vehicle, you know, we're looking at a very low percentage. So you're then looking at what is the list price of the vehicle, multiply that by the percentage, which in many cases for electric vehicles is going to be sort of maybe up to say 2%. That is a very small amount. So the employee will be paid tax on that amount. The employer will pay what's known as Class 1A national insurance on that, which obviously that's been subject to a lot of change in the last few months. But in very broad terms, if we look at the sort of tax year that's just ended, the 21-22 tax year, that rate was 13.8%. So cost to the employer, if you provide an employee with salary, you're looking at broad terms, let's say you do a salary sacrifice of £5,000. The employer is going to say, in very broad terms, 13.8% of that amount. The employee is going to say tax at their marginal rate, assuming that the taxable benefit is very, very, very low. And the employee is also going to save national insurance. So it's a winner for everybody. The employer saves employer's national insurance, the employee saves employee's national insurance and also tax, because they're sacrificing a higher amount for a lower taxable benefit. That's always going to be your objective when you're looking at salary sacrifice. It's the same sort of thing applies if you're looking at, say, salary sacrifice for pension. Pension, you're going to get tax relief, so the tax relief position should be fairly neutral. If you do that by way of salary sacrifice, again, the employer is going to save employer's national insurance on the amount sacrificed, and the employee is going to save employee's national insurance.
So a win-win situation.
A win-win situation. But you're quite right in that the paperwork is critical. Policies are critical. The revenue will be looking to make sure that the employee has signed up for it correctly, that they have either changed their contract of employment, obviously if they've got an existing arrangement and they're going into salary sacrifice, or indeed if they're a new employee, that the package that they're on reflects the true position. So they will look carefully at that. And if they consider that the paperwork doesn't stack up and it's not been done at the correct time, then there could be ramifications for both the employer and employee, because they will have done what's known as effectively like a failed salary sacrifice. So the savings that they've achieved will then no longer be available. And the revenue would go back and say, hold on a minute, how long has this been going on?
So of course, I'm going to say this from the employment perspective, Paul, in that making sure that you're properly advised and your policies are properly considered at the point of implication and the impacts on employees' contracts of employment. But it sounds like that's even more important from the tax perspective, that you're making sure that before your scheme is rolled out, that it's been properly thought through and administered. Yeah,
most certainly. You know, the revenue do like to see an appropriate paper trail. Obviously, paper is perhaps the wrong word now, but they like to see it as an appropriate trail of documentation. They also want to ensure that the employer has got it right. So they will look very carefully at any arrangement that's in place. But it is an attractive opportunity for everybody. The other thing I would mention is that communication is key. If you are looking to introduce a salary sacrifice, whether it be for pension sacrifice, whether it be for cycle to work, whether it be for electric vehicles, communication with employees to understand how it works is very important. Because of course, whether you use the word salary sacrifice, salary exchange, whatever you use, as far as the employee is concerned, their headline salary is going to be lower because it's being replaced by a benefit. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind, it's not necessarily all about the taxman or all about the employment law. It's also about the individual's personal position, because of course, if you're going to reduce their salary in some way, then you may also, that may impact on their ability to borrow, may impact on things such as national minimum wage, depending on how far you're reducing their salary. So there are lots of ramifications to a salary sacrifice. Some of them are more on the sort of high level, but some will be down to an individual personal choice in deciding whether they want to go for it or not.
And that's a very important point about the national minimum wage. Again, the law is clear that you can't sacrifice your salary to the extent that it takes you below the national minimum wage. And so that is something perhaps not relevant to an awful lot of people, but may well be, as you say, Paul, on the individual circumstance perspective.
Yeah, and it's an easy one for the revenue to check, because when they go and look at individuals' pay slips as part of their review that they may undertake on an employer, then they will be looking at that, and it doesn't take much to look at a pay slip of some lower paid employees, or indeed any employee as part of a salary sacrifice arrangement, and say, well, hold on a minute, does this work out or not?
Excellent. So sticking on the theme of salary sacrifice, another issue that we've seen employers look to implement more so in recent years is the issue of buying and selling annual leave. And again, insofar as that impacts on salary sacrifice, particularly where employees are purchasing annual leave. Again, this flexibility in the annual leave system is another way that you can very quickly and easily add benefit to your employees' contracts of employment. So you will find some employees who are quite happy to sacrifice a portion of their salary in exchange for having an extra 5 days off annual leave per year. particularly if that enables them to sort of manage work-life balance, spend more time with families, do the types of things that people got used to doing during the pandemic when more time was available. That doesn't come without risk to the business, because obviously if you are permitting your employees to take more annual leave, then you have to bear in mind what the impact is then going to be on your service delivery. So if all of a sudden everybody wants to take an additional 1 week's annual leave per year in exchange for a salary sacrifice, then you could find that you are having difficulties in manning and maintaining your staffing levels across the whole 52-week period. So that is going to bring in considerations such as who's going to be allowed to have what time off and when, and that is going to necessitate considerations such as flexibility, such as discrimination issues. You need to ensure that if you are permitting the purchase of additional annual leave, or when that person takes that annual leave, that you are doing so in a non-discriminatory manner. Paul, from the tax perspective, what benefit is there to the employer and the employee in a salary sacrifice for leave purposes?
Well, salary sacrifice for annual leave is relatively straightforward from a tax perspective, because of course, to the extent that an employee is purchasing an extra day's annual leave, they're going to get less pay. So they're going to be purchasing that from their gross salary. So the cost to them will be their net pay for 1 day, really. So it's important that the salary sacrifice is done from gross pay. The revenue say these special rules that I mentioned earlier, the optional remuneration arrangement legislation doesn't apply for salary sacrifice for annual leave. So as a consequence, it's fairly straightforward. To the extent that they're buying leave, their salary will reduce for tax purposes, and that will be the saving to them. And of course, the attraction is that they will have more time off. I have also seen salary sacrifice for leave arrangements introduced, whereby people who might be considering going part-time, instead of going down to, let's say, 4 days a week, they buy some extra leave, maybe 10 or 20 days even. That gives them the flexibility to then take a bit of extra time off that they want. But you've still got them, instead of having them over only 4 days a week, you may potentially have them working for you for 4.5 days a week on average over a 52-week period. So I think the salary sacrifice arrangement does give a great deal of flexibility for both the employer and the employee. But of course, as you quite rightly said, Juliet, employers have got to be very aware of the business requirements to make sure they're not left short-staffed, because a lot of employees are taking advantage of this opportunity. And I think in some respects, many employers would probably reduce the amount of salary sacrifice they could do, perhaps to 3 or 5 days per year.
And flipping that on its head, we're also seeing businesses who are offering staff the opportunity to sell some of their leave back. So perhaps an employee has 30 days annual leave, and in addition, they have the 8 bank holidays, albeit 10 this year. And actually think, I don't need that. I'd rather have some more money than some more leave. So again, we're increasingly seeing issues whereby employees are asking to do this and asking for some flexibility, particularly in the current cost of living crisis. Certain employees may think that a little bit more money in their bank every month is better than a couple of days annual leave. Again, on the face of it, this doesn't create any difficulties from an employment law perspective, save that, and I'm going to come back to this time and time again, is that it's all about the policy. It's all about making sure that employees are clear as to what they're entitled to do, how they have to go about it, and what the implications are for their contracts of employment. You also, as a business, need to be aware that you cannot permit an employee to sell so much annual leave that it takes them below the working time regulation threshold. So all employees will need to take, certainly on a pro rata basis, 28 days leave, including, in most cases, that includes public holidays. So if you have somebody who is on 28 days leave and wants to sell 10 days, then clearly that's going to create a difficulty. So we do need to bear in mind that whatever position you're in, that the employee ends up at the end of the annual leave year having taken what the law requires them to take. But again, there is nothing then to stop that employee from selling that additional leave. And actually, as a business, you may find that is something that, whilst not to be encouraged, is actually quite beneficial, because the cost of the person's annual leave is probably going to be much less than the benefit they will provide to the business in that additional day or days that they're working.
The other point to make in respect of selling of annual leave is clearly that's going to increase an employee's pay for tax purposes. Employees will, of course, need to be very careful to the extent that they're increasing their pay, but that doesn't affect any entitlement to benefits. So, for example, if they're going to increase their pay, then that may have an impact on, let's say, on universal credit. So it's almost like the reverse of the salary sacrifice, whereby you've got to be very careful with national minimum wage point of view from the employer's perspective. When you're increasing your salary, the concern is probably going to be more from the individual personal perspective as opposed to the business perspective. But just because an employee is going to be taking home more money from a net pay position doesn't then mean that that's not going to cause a problem for them as far as universal credit or claiming of any benefits they might be looking for.
Absolutely. Thank you. Moving away then from salary sacrifice, one of the other major topics that we want to focus on is that of the remote or place flexible basis of working. And most studies indicate that there a balance between remote working and working in the office, the workplace, is the preferred approach post-pandemic. So recent studies have found that as many as 50% of workers favour flexibility as the top perk. And so this could therefore be a company's greatest asset in attracting or retaining staff. Evidence has also demonstrated that flexibility in the place of work has a positive impact on productivity. During 2020, the steepest productivity improvements came in April and May, during the height of the first lockdown and the height of the pandemic. Much of this was due to the elimination of daily commutes and lengthy in-person meetings. A study by Google found that a quarter of parents are playing the role of primary caregiver post-pandemic. And so the option of working remotely allows businesses to access this underrepresented market. So it could be a way to attract and retain the talent of parents that otherwise may not have been able to contemplate returning to work until their children were older. It's also a way of tapping into other areas, such as those with disabilities who may previously have been unable to access certain working locations, but that all becomes so much easier if people are working remotely or certainly place flexible. It's also going to lead, obviously, to business costs being lowered. With less employees in the office, there is less of a space to heat, to light, to maintain. And there's also going to be a positive impact on the environment, both in terms of what electricity, what energy supplies businesses are using, but also in the sense of fewer people commuting to work or travelling to in-person meetings. Being open to remote working may also see vacancies being filled as the applicant pool is broadened. So going back to a point I made at the outset, if your pool of talent grows, then that can only be of benefit to the business, and the pool of talent is undoubtedly going to grow if you're not reliant on recruiting somebody who lives within a certain set number of miles of your workplace. It could also see the retention of staff, because studies have shown the indisputable demand for some form of remote working post-pandemic. However, how does this answer the deficits in areas where the employee is required to be in a certain place? We know there are certain industries where working remotely or working from home or working on a place flexible basis just simply doesn't work. So looking at areas such as hospitality, healthcare, some of the areas that are actually finding it most difficult to recruit post-pandemic are probably the areas where it will be the hardest to implement some kind of place flexible working. There are also other potential difficulties. So requests for remote flexible working may lead to employers having to manage a variety of working arrangements, which may actually in turn lead to increased costs. There may be a need of coming back to this point again to more policies. So how are you going to require your employees to make their applications for remote flexible working? Who's going to consider that? What factors are going to be considered as part of that process? And how are you going to meet conflicting demands in an open, transparent, objective and non-discriminatory way? There is also the difficulty undoubtedly in monitoring employee well-being and performance. So how do you know that somebody is performing as you want them to, or how do you know that they are happy in what they're doing if you are less sighted on them on a day-to-day basis? Businesses will also need to bear in mind matters such as client confidentiality and data protection, depending on where the employee is based. What internet connection will they be using? Is this secure? Is it a public network? Is data potentially exposed to others? How are files stored and retained? And so again, I think it comes back to the buzzword of policy all the way, and making sure that if you are looking at some form of remote working arrangement, whether that be an employee working partly at home, partly in the office, or even partly elsewhere, and I'm sure that's something you'll come on to, Paul, having the correct and appropriate policies in place and making sure that all employees that are going to be subject to either benefiting from those policies or managing those policies are properly trained in how to apply them. Paul, from a tax perspective, are there any issues over allowing employees to work flexibly, whether that be at home or elsewhere?
Where do we start, really? I think that one of the biggest challenges is going to be identification of workers. It's funny, you were mentioning all the different categories of worker there and the pools of workers that you might be able to draw. And there is, of course, another one, which I'm part of, actually. I'm a classic remote worker. UNW are based in Newcastle upon Tyne. In January 2020, I moved to West Wales and I retired. I missed the exciting world of tax so much that I was lured back into it. And in September 2020, I started working for UNW on a part-time basis, 3 days a week. So I think there is scope for actually getting people back into work that are of an older generation. Well, I try not to class myself in that much too much, but certainly there is an opportunity there. But I've been speaking to a lot of people recently about hybrid working, whatever you want to call it, remote working. And one of the key questions employers, to my mind, need to ask themselves is, who is impacted by this? How many remote workers do we actually have? Now, of course, in the ideal world, you would expect that HR would know, and obviously I appreciate that many of you that might be on the call today are within HR, so I suspect if we could see you, you might be nodding your heads. HR should know who is working remotely, who has been employed to work remotely, who worked remotely during the COVID crisis and is continuing to work remotely. How many days a week are they required to actually be in the office? Are those remote workers actually working in the UK? Or do they actually have a place overseas where they've turned around to their manager and said, oh, can we actually work there for a particular length of time during the year? You know, wouldn't it be great to work in Spain during the winter that we're coming up to now? So all of those things do potentially have tax implications. So, and if I was a tax inspector looking at this question in more detail, and travel and subsistence is the key point here, I would suspect that they would go into an employer, turn around and say, right, can you identify any workers that you've got that work in any way remotely? And as a consequence, can you also confirm what you're doing as regards to paying their expenses? So having that information ready is very important for an employer. It's all again about processes and policies and information. So your ideal position is you're able to demonstrate to the revenue you're well on top of it, you know what's going on, you know what the tax consequences are, and you're taking the appropriate action. However, I suspect that many employers could well struggle to identify who all of these workers actually are. So yes, the answer to your question, the short answer is yes, there are some tax ramifications, but identification of who the individuals are and what their working arrangements are is critical in deciding what those ramifications are.
And in terms of the employee, is there any benefit to them in working from home from a financial perspective?
Well, from them, and again, this is quite a weird one, and a subject that's been debated is that, you know, if you've got a new employee that's joined you, and are you going to offer them a little bit of a package when they've got to go to their, what was potentially their office, shall we say, inverted commas? Where is their office? Do they have what's known as a permanent workplace? Are you allowing them to work from home for a couple of days a week? So employees that work from home arguably are saving transport costs and getting to what was their previous workplace. But they could argue, well, there are costs that we've got to incur at home. Now that then leads on to the revenue allowance that they give for £6 per week. That's been very widely publicised. In fact, we were chatting earlier, weren't we, Juliet, that was mentioned actually on the Martin Lewis show last night. This £6 allowance that employees may claim tax relief on was available for 2021 tax year and the 21-22 tax year with special rules in place for COVID and on a much more relaxed basis. Going from April 2022, those relaxations were withdrawn. So the vast majority of employees that were able to claim allowances in the earlier years won't be able to claim them going forward because it's their employers that have given them the flexibility rather than there being a requirement that they must work from home. So the benefits are probably more, certainly less from a financial point, less from an obvious benefit point of view, more from a cost saving point of view, I would say, as far as transportation is concerned. And
you've just talked about the tightening up of those benefits. Now we're moving more post-COVID. Is it too late for employees to claim this now?
No, employees can go back and either complete a tax return or go into the revenue website and plug in some information. The revenue website is reasonably easy to use. Obviously, I suppose I would say that, specialising in tax, but it's certainly worth having a look at what claims can be made from employees working from home. And again, if you Google working from home and tax reliefs, see what you can get within the gov.uk website.
So would you say, Paul, that that's a little bit of an easy win for employers? It's not costing them anything, but to actually promote that ability to reclaim to employees could make them seem like a nice employer.
No, yeah, sorry, I'm not sure whether the answer is no or yes. So I would say that is a really good idea because a lot of the time employees are not aware of the opportunities. But just to explain to them, you know, that during the COVID period, there was this opportunity to claim some tax relief for working from home. You know, make reference to the revenue guidance. You know, indeed, of course, some people may actually take note from what Martin Lewis says. You know, Martin Lewis was a very big advocate and did work very hard trying to persuade the revenue to make things easier for the employees to actually claim those reliefs. So yeah, I would say pointing the employees in the right direction is a good idea. You've always faced the challenge, of course, of the questions that you might get from employees. Hopefully you won't be deluged by a lot of people outside your door saying, can you call the tax man for me, which is a lot of people clearly might be concerned about, but pointing in the right direction is not a bad idea at all.
Thank you. Just moving on, Paul, to some quick fire topics and some ad hoc benefits. So forgive me if I'm going to just throw some questions at you of things employers might want to consider and what the tax implications of them are. What about staff entertainment? Again, we've seen during the pandemic, everything shut down, people weren't mixing, people weren't going out. And now hopefully we're getting back into the world whereby Christmas parties can happen and so on and so forth. If employers now want to offer that benefit to bring the workplace back together again, are there any tax issues?
Yes, potentially. There's always tax issues. I think that anything that happens, if you're providing anything for an employee, the number one question should be, is there a tax issue that we need to think about here? Because in many cases there will be. And I would also say that if you're doing something and the revenue come in and do a visit, when I say the revenue, the inland revenue, HM revenue and customs come in and do a visit, they will expect you as employers to be able to demonstrate why you consider something is not taxable. The onus is on you. So as a consequence, when you're talking about staff entertaining, some staff entertaining will be eligible for what's known as a tax exemption. There are two key exemptions that employers need to be aware of. The first one is the Christmas party exemption. So if an employer provides an annual function, such as a Christmas party, could be a summer barbecue, for instance, it could be a couple of events, but if they do that, then the revenue will have an exemption available. Providing the event was available to all, then providing the cost, including VAT, of that annual function does not exceed £150, then there will be no taxable benefit. So you're looking at the total cost per head and that £150 limit. The revenue also introduced a few years ago something known as a trivial benefit exemption. Now, this trivial benefit exemption is a very useful exemption, and the key conditions is that the benefit must not exceed £50 per head, including VAT. It must not be part of a salary sacrifice arrangement. It must not be in the form of cash or a cash voucher. So a store voucher is not a cash voucher. So that's fine if you're going to provide a store voucher, let's say at Christmas. And most critically, it mustn't be reward or recognition. So the revenue don't want you turning around and saying, right, okay, congratulations, you've been employee of the month. Here's a £50 voucher. And then for employers to think that that's not taxable, that will be taxable, because as far as the revenue are concerned, that is reward and recognition. Equally, if someone has a long service award, that is probably going to be taxable. It won't be eligible for this exemption. There are other exemptions for long service, but one of the key criteria for that is that the employee must have served a minimum of 20 years service. So there are various exemptions available, but the key thing to do is flag the potential benefits that you're providing to your employees, then work out, are they taxable or are they eligible for an exemption? And that is something that we often do on a regular basis. If it transpires that a benefit is taxable, all is not lost, because the employer may actually settle the tax liability on the employee's behalf. So it might be worthwhile me at this stage, perhaps just giving a bit of an example here. So I'd mentioned the Christmas word earlier, didn't I? Which is unfortunately not a million miles away from us, although I've got like tons of shopping to do. But many employers would want to give, let's say, a voucher to an employee at Christmas, or maybe perhaps a small Christmas hamper. That's where your trivial benefit exemption is going to come in handy. So if you've got a voucher that you're going to provide to them, let's say a store voucher for £40, no problem, because it satisfies the criteria that I just mentioned for trivial benefit exemption. It doesn't exceed £50. It's not part of a salary sacrifice. It's not in the form of cash or a cash voucher, and it's not reward or recognition. Fine, no problem. However, if you want to give them a £75 voucher, then that's more of a problem. The £50 is not an allowance, it's an exemption. So if you exceed it by a penny effectively, that exemption won't be available. So if you're going to give your employees, say, £75 vouchers at Christmas, the whole amount will be taxable. Now, clearly, employees might not be very impressed if you turn around to them and say, hope you have a great Christmas. Here's your £75 voucher. By the way, you've got to pay some tax on it. So the revenue have got what's known as a PAYE settlement agreement process that employers may use to pay the tax on behalf of the employees. It's not a cheap exercise, but it does avoid all that administration and perhaps the demotivational effect that it might have if you were to turn around to give the award in one hand, but then turn around and say you've got a tax issue that you've got to deal with the other. So the exemptions are very useful. One point I would add, sorry, once I get started on this subject, you struggle to stop me, don't you? This exemption does not cover working lunches, okay? If you provide a working lunch at the employee's normal workplace, then the revenue view is that will be taxable. Because of course they expect that an employee will provide food at their own workplace. The revenue do provide some very useful guidance on this. Again, I feel a little bit here as though I'm a bit of an advert for HM Revenue Customs and their website. But if you have a look in the Revenue's Employment Income Manual for trivial benefits, you will find details of all these conditions and some very useful examples explaining when those exemptions are available.
And with the exemptions, Paul, is that one per year, one per employee, or is it?
No, it can be a multitude of events per year. You've obviously got to be careful, especially when looking at vouchers, that you don't provide vouchers for the same place, and that you've got to watch a bit of for aggregation potentially on that. But it is possible to provide a voucher, let's say a voucher at Easter or a voucher for birthday sort of thing. But the revenue will look at it on a per occasion sort of basis. So again, you may be looking at staff entertaining, you might take 5 employees out, let's say because it's the end of the week or whatever, or it's been an employee's birthday. So the revenue will say, well, you don't have to worry about what everybody had. You could just say the total cost of the bill was this, divided by the number of attendees. That's the cost per head when considering whether this £50 exemption applies. The one thing that is, there is one potential cap, well, there is a cap on it for smaller businesses that are known as close companies. There is a limit of £300 per person per year for directors and their families, but that was an anti-avoidance measure that was introduced to sort of stop people abusing the situation and effectively potentially keeping on paying out these £50 vouchers sort of thing, really. So useful exemptions to be aware of, really.
And we all know that we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. We hear nothing but, and the government seem to chop and change as to what the impact of that is going to be on all of us. If businesses were looking to mitigate the impact of the cost of living crisis for their employees by making cost of living payment or something of that nature, again, are there tax implications for both employer and employee of doing that?
I seem like an old record, really, don't I, with the same answer? Yes, unfortunately, that there are tax implications, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, there could be issues as regards to the benefits that employees receive and that having an adverse effect on them. So you might think you're doing them a favour by giving them some money that increases their net pay, but actually from a credit point of view, that's reducing. So the benefit that they're getting may not be as good as they're expecting. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, depending on which tax month you're giving it in, if you're giving it as a lump sum, it could push them into a higher tax threshold for that particular month, which might be rectified in the following month, depending on their tax code. So potentially a bit messy, but it's certainly something we're getting a lot of questions from clients on this subject. And that's the advice we're giving to them. Yes, it can be a good idea, but please be aware it could have an adverse effect on the individuals that may be claiming some universal credits or similar benefits.
And again, a couple of slightly different quick-fire questions, but ones that I think catch us all out. So what about the employee that is not provided with a mobile phone by their employer, but instead is compensated for calls that are made on their own phone? Is that a problem for the employer and the employee?
It is, and it's funny, well, maybe it's not funny is the right word. Unfortunately, tax does not always work how you think it might work, and this is where we've got a bit of a mismatch, really. So if an employer provides their employee with their mobile phone and the contract is in the name of the employer, then there will be no taxable benefit, even if the employee uses that for personal calls or use of browsing, all the various things you can do on your phone these days. However, if an employee uses their own phone and makes a claim to the employer, then it's quite possible there will be a tax implication. If they're able to claim for just business calls, which they're able to identify, then that is fine. But of course, as we all know, that with the vast majority of mobile phones, most people have a bit of a package. So therefore, it's very difficult to identify the specific cost of one call. So the chances are that the employer will be reimbursing the employee either on the cost of their package per month or maybe a percentage of it. But by doing so, that does cause a tax issue, both from tax and a national insurance point of view.
And what about employees that use their own vehicle for work purposes, in terms of mileage allowance, or perhaps the employee that is provided with a fuel card by their employer, which they are also permitted to use to fill up their personal vehicle? Are there tax implications from that?
Wow, we've got onto vehicles. We could talk for the whole afternoon on this, couldn't we, really? Employers who use their own cars for business are able to claim, or their employers are able to reimburse them up to 45 pence per mile for the first 10,000 business miles and 25 pence thereafter. If employers don't pay at that particular rate, then the employees may be able to claim tax relief on the difference between that 45 and that 25p and the rates that their employers do actually pay to them. In some circumstances, and the most common for this is where the employee has a car allowance. So they don't have a company car, they have the car allowance, but the employer says, well, hold on a minute, I've given you a car allowance. I'm not going to pay you 45p a mile when you go on a business journey. I'm going to pay you a much smaller amount, maybe 15 or 20 pence a mile, in which case you've got that differential between the revenue rates and the rate that the employer is paying. But those rates, I must stress, are only in respect of employees who use their own cars for business. There are different rates that apply for employees who have company cars, and those are published by the Revenue and known as advisory fuel rates. As far as employees that have fuel cards, if employees have fuel cards and use those for their own vehicles, then that will itself be a taxable benefit. That will need to be reported by the employer, and the employer will pay employer's national insurance on it through the P11D process. The employee may be able to claim some tax relief on it, but they'll have to keep very detailed business mileage records. I would add that the whole subject of fuel cards can cause quite a few problems with the revenue. One of the situations that have arisen over the last few years is that as company car benefit has increased dramatically, then so has the fuel card benefit. The fuel card benefit and the fuel benefit for an employee and their private fuel is now very costly, such that a lot of employees have turned around and said, well, I want to keep the fuel card, but I don't want to pay the tax liability. Now, the only way in which you can not have that happening is if the employee is only provided with business fuel. And the way you establish what that business fuel is, you have to keep detailed business mileage records. So therefore, as a consequence, you look at what the total cost of the fuel is. The employee has to work out what the business mileage is of the total mileage. That will be the amount that the employer can actually pay through the fuel card, but they must make good all of their private fuel. And again, that can only be done by keeping detailed business mileage records. Those mileage records are not detailed, or if the employee is estimating how much they're actually spending on private fuel a month and is making that good to the employer, then it's very likely that revenue will challenge that. They will disagree, and then there will be a significant tax liability because there should have been a fuel benefit charge on the company car.
Basically what we're coming around to again is a clear policy and a clear process of making sure that you are properly informing and keeping employees informed of what they are entitled to do, when they're entitled to do it, how things will be monitored, how they will be implemented, so that employees are fully aware of what is and isn't allowed and what the tax status of that might or might not be. We've certainly seen from our perspective that unclear policies as to what company fuel cards can be used for potentially leads to dispute between employer and employee as to whether what the employee is doing is misconduct, whether it's allowed. And what we've seen time and time again is the absence of a clear, transparent, fair policy is where everybody comes unstuck.
And I think as far as the revenue are concerned, their key aspect on that will be the monitoring, because if the monitoring is what should we call it, slapdash in any way, then they will be on it like a ton of bricks. Basically, they will say, well, the onus is always on the employer to demonstrate they are following the policy and that they have the information to demonstrate why they've adopted a particular tax treatment and therefore satisfy the revenue.
And then just finishing off on one where I hope you're going to tell us there's no tax implications of this. Staff perks. What we see more and more now is that businesses have bargaining and negotiating power with, say, local businesses, whether that be eating out in particular restaurant chains or using the gym and so on and so forth. If a business, an employer negotiates a deal like that its employees can benefit from, is there any tax issue for either the employee or the employer from either a negative or a positive perspective to being able to negotiate these benefits that you can then sell on to the employee?
There shouldn't be, because a benefit in kind is typically calculated using the cost to the employer providing the benefit. Clearly, if an employer has gone out and been able to negotiate a discounted rate for the membership of something or the cost of something, there is no cost to them. They just managed to secure that deal. If, however, there is a cost, then there will be a tax consequence. So quite a straightforward answer to that, but you've always got to think about, is there a cost to the employer?
Nice to end on one where there might not be a tax implication if we're lucky.
If we're lucky.
Okay, are there any questions or any issues from anybody on the call?
There's not at the moment, but I did get some in advance though.
Sorry everyone, just to explain, Adam McGlynn from the team is sat off camera, so we're not speaking without moving our lips.
I did have to nip away, so this might have been covered already, but a client recently was asking about salary sacrifice and pension schemes. Was that covered it?
We briefly covered pensions. We've covered salary sacrifice. We didn't specifically cover pensions. What was there a more detail, or can it be done? Or
yeah, they just wanted to know kind of if there was some pros to considering a salary sacrifice approach to pensions rather to employee contributions.
Well, from a tax perspective, I think a large number of employers have already got salary sacrifice in place for pension schemes. The challenge for employers with any salary sacrifice scheme, or whatever you wish to call it, is actually selling it to the employees. So employee understanding is critical, but in general terms, a pension that's provided by way of salary sacrifice will be more national insurance efficient than in a pension scheme that is not provided by salary sacrifice, because the employee will only get tax relief on their contribution as opposed to tax and national insurance. And of course, if the employer does it by salary sacrifice, they will be saving 13.8% employers' national insurance using the old rates.
And last, when we did this in person the other week, we did also touch on our 35, but I don't think we quite need to do that this week, do we?
Not this week, maybe next.
No, but needless to say that, yes, we're back to as we were with IR35. And as I was mentioning in respect to the hybrid working, one of the big challenges with IR35 is identification of all those off payroll workers. And again, your ideal position is if you get a question from the revenue, you're able to demonstrate you know exactly who your off payroll workers are. You've been able to demonstrate that you've considered their status very carefully. And as a consequence, you're happy with the way in which you're treating them either as a self-employed or employed.
Any IR35 questions, I will direct them to Adam McGlynn.
Well, there is a question that's just appeared on the chat here. We are offering all employees a Christmas event, but at 2 different locations, and people will be invited based on their location. Does this cover the tax test of being offered to all? The 2 events won't be exactly the same time.
Yeah, that should be fine. The revenue got something within their guidance that actually confirms that. If you want me to, I can send you a link to that. If you let me know who is asking that question, I will find the link and let you know.
Okay, well, I think we're just about coming up to 1 o'clock now. So first and foremost, can I thank everybody for attending today? It really is appreciated. And we do hope that it has been of some use to you. Obviously, I think the underlying conclusion to all of this is that tax is not simple. There are lots of pitfalls, but also lots of perks to both the employer and the employee in terms of benefits and issues that they can offer to their employees. And I think the other underlying theme is that record keeping and policy is key, and making sure that things are properly documented, are offered fairly and objectively, and that nothing is tainted by discrimination, for example, is going to be the key to all of this. Obviously, if anybody has any questions that they want to raise with us offline, both in terms of what they're proposing to offer or the mechanisms that they should put in place when offering those issues, then please feel free to drop us an email, call an email, and I'm sure between us we will be more than happy and able to assist. And then my final thank you goes to Paul, who has been on a little bit of a tour of Europe, I think, over the last couple of days before landing here in Cardiff today. So I'm really, really grateful, Paul, that you've taken some time out of your very busy schedule to come and speak to us about the fascinating world of employment tax, and hopefully a safe onward journey home this afternoon. But otherwise, unless there's anything else, thank you ever so much, everybody, for attending. Hope you have a lovely rest of day, and hopefully we'll catch you all again soon.